When my husband's mother, Patricia, showed up with 3 suitcases claiming her house had a gas leak emergency, I welcomed her into our home. 4 months later, when I discovered she'd been intercepting my mail and secretly applying for a reverse mortgage on my inherited property, I packed my bags and walked out. But here's the twist she never saw coming. The deed was in my name only, and I was taking my house with me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Thompson, and if someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office at 32, filing papers to evict my own mother-in-law from the house my grandmother left me, I would have laughed. But life has a way of teaching you lessons you never thought you'd need to learn, especially about family, boundaries, and the people who claim to love you while systematically destroying everything you've worked to build. I should probably start at the beginning, back when I thought having Patricia as a mother-in-law was just an ordinary challenge that came with marriage. Mike and I had been together for 8 years, married for 6 of those, and we'd built what I thought was a solid partnership in the cozy ranch house on Maple Street that my grandmother Rose had left me when she passed 3 years ago. And the house wasn't massive or fancy, but it was mine. A 4-bedroom home with hardwood floors, a sunlit kitchen, and a backyard garden that I'd lovingly restored to match the way Grandma Rose had kept it. Working as a freelance marketing consultant allowed me the flexibility to run my business from the converted spare bedroom that served as my home office. The setup was perfect for my lifestyle, giving me the independence to choose my clients, while maintaining the work-life balance that mattered so much to me. Mike worked as a regional sales manager for a tech company downtown, which meant regular travel, but also a steady income that complemented my variable consulting fees. We'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the years, sharing household responsibilities and supporting each other's career goals without much drama or conflict. Patricia had always been what I generously called involved in our marriage. She lived about 40 minutes away in a sprawling 2-story house in Round Rock that she'd shared with Mike's father until his death 4 years earlier. Since becoming a widow, she'd developed an increasing tendency to insert herself into our decisions, from questioning my cooking methods when she visited for Sunday dinners, to offering unsolicited advice about our finances, career choices, and why we hadn't given her grandchildren yet. Mike, being her only child, had learned long ago to navigate her strong personality with a combination of gentle deflection and strategic agreement that kept the peace but didn't always address the underlying issues. The dynamic had been manageable, mostly because Patricia maintained her own residence and her own life. She had her book club, her bridge group, and her volunteer work at the local hospital gift shop. Our interactions were limited to weekly phone calls, monthly dinners, and major holidays, which felt like enough contact to maintain family relationships without overwhelming our marriage. I'd grown accustomed to her particular brand of motherly interference, learning to smile and change, the subject when she started her lectures about proper household management or appropriate wifely duties. What I hadn't prepared for was the phone call that came on a Tuesday evening in October, just as Mike and I were settling down to watch a movie after dinner. Mike answered his cell phone with his usual cheerful greeting, but his expression quickly shifted to concern as he listened to his mother's voice on the other end. "What do you mean, a gas leak?" he said, muting the television as I turned to watch his face grow more worried. "How serious is it? Are you safe? Where are you staying? Tonight?" I could hear Patricia's voice through the phone, high-pitched and dramatic in the way it became whenever she faced any kind of crisis, real or perceived. Mike ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture I recognized as his stress response, while he listened to what sounded like a lengthy explanation of her housing emergency. "Of course you can stay with us," Mike said without hesitation, glancing at me with an apologetic expression that asked for understanding. "Don't worry about anything else right now. Just pack whatever you need and drive over. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." After he hung up, Mike turned to me with the slightly overwhelmed look he wore whenever his mother's needs suddenly became our immediate problem. "There's been some kind of gas leak at Mom's house," he explained, reaching for my hand. "The utility company shut off her gas and told her she can't stay there until they fix whatever's wrong with the lines. She's pretty shaken up about it." My first instinct was sympathy, naturally. The idea of Patricia dealing with a home emergency, alone, especially at her age, triggered my protective instincts despite our sometimes complicated relationship. "Of course she should stay here," I agreed, already mentally preparing the guest bedroom and thinking through the logistics of having an unexpected house guest. "How long do they think the repairs will take?" Mike shrugged, still looking concerned. She wasn't really clear about that part. "You know how Mom gets when she's upset? She focuses on the crisis without thinking about practical details. But it can't be more than a few days, right? How long could a gas leak repair possibly take?" Those words would come back to haunt both of us in ways we couldn't have imagined that evening. At the time, they seemed perfectly reasonable. Gas leaks were serious safety issues that required immediate attention, and responsible utility companies wouldn't delay necessary repairs. A few days of hosting Patricia seemed like a small inconvenience compared to the potential danger she'd face if she stayed in her own home during the repair process. Within an hour, Patricia arrived at our front door with 3 large suitcases, 2 shopping bags full of what appeared to be toiletries and medications, and a small cooler that she claimed contained perishable foods from her refrigerator. She looked genuinely distressed, her usually perfectly styled gray hair slightly disheveled, and her face showing signs of the stress that comes with sudden displacement from familiar surroundings. "I'm so sorry to impose on you both," she said, as Mike helped carry her luggage into the house. "I just didn't know where else to go." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gas company man said it could be dangerous to stay there even one more night, and you know I don't have any other family nearby. I assured her that she was welcome and that we understood completely. The guest bedroom had been Mike's childhood, room during the summers he'd spent with my grandmother, so it felt appropriate that his mother would stay there during her own time of need. I helped her get settled, making sure she had fresh towels and comfortable bedding, while Mike called a few local hotels just to explore alternatives in case she preferred more privacy during the repair process. "Hotels are so impersonal," Patricia said when Mike mentioned the possibility. "I'd much rather stay with family if you don't mind having me underfoot for a few days. It's been so long since I've had the chance to spend real time with you both." The sentiment seemed sincere, and I found myself looking forward to the opportunity to strengthen our relationship. Patricia and I had never been particularly close, but I'd always attributed that to the natural adjustment period that comes with joining established family dynamics. Perhaps having her stay with us would give us the chance to develop a more genuine friendship, the kind of mother-daughter relationship I'd missed since my own mother had passed away during my college years. That first evening passed pleasantly enough. Patricia insisted on cooking dinner as a way to contribute to the household, preparing Mike's favorite pot roast with all the traditional sides he remembered from childhood. She shared stories about Mike's youth that I'd never heard before, and he seemed genuinely happy to have this unexpected time with his mother. The 3 of us sat around the dining room table longer than usual, talking and laughing in a way that felt natural and comfortable. After dinner, Patricia insisted on cleaning up despite my protests, claiming that she needed to stay busy to keep her mind off her housing situation. While she worked in the kitchen, Mike and I retreated to the living room where he expressed relief that his mother seemed to be handling the crisis better than he'd initially feared. "I was worried she'd be completely panicked," he admitted, keeping his voice low so Patricia wouldn't overhear. "You know how she can get when her routine is disrupted. But she seems to be adapting pretty well to staying here." I agreed, feeling optimistic about the temporary arrangement. Patricia had been gracious and helpful, showing none of the critical tendencies that sometimes surfaced during her regular visits. Perhaps the vulnerability of her situation had softened some of her more difficult edges, or maybe the informal setting of an extended stay would allow us to interact more naturally than we did during the structured formality of scheduled family dinners. The first few days confirmed this hopeful assessment. Patricia maintained the guest bedroom with military precision, never leaving personal items in common areas or creating any sense of clutter or disorder. She contributed to household meals, often preparing breakfast before Mike and I woke up, and she volunteered to handle various cleaning tasks that she claimed would help her feel useful rather than burdensome. Her presence actually made our daily routine somewhat easier, since she took care of many domestic tasks that would normally fall to me during my breaks from client work. My home office routine remained largely unchanged during those initial days. Patricia seemed to understand that my work required concentration and privacy, making an effort to keep noise levels down during my scheduled client calls and video conferences. She'd often spend her mornings reading in the living room or working in the backyard garden, which she claimed reminded her of her own landscaping projects at home. Her appreciation for the flowers and vegetables I'd been cultivating seemed genuine, and she offered helpful suggestions based on her years of gardening experience. The only minor adjustment involved my usual practice of working with my office, door open to allow natural light and air circulation throughout the house. With Patricia moving around the common areas during the day, I found myself closing the door more often to maintain professional boundaries during client interactions. It was a small change that seemed perfectly reasonable given the temporary nature of her stay. Mike checked in regularly with the gas company and the repair contractors working on Patricia's house, but the timeline remained frustratingly vague. Initial estimates of a few days stretched into a week, then 2 weeks, as the scope of the necessary repairs apparently expanded beyond the original gas leak issue. According to Patricia's reports of conversations with various technicians and contractors, the problem had revealed underlying issues with her home's aging utility systems that required more extensive work than anyone had initially anticipated. "These old houses," she'd say with a weary shake of her head whenever Mike asked for updates. "Once they start finding problems, there's always something else that needs attention. The contractor says it's better to fix everything now, rather than have more emergencies later." The explanation sounded reasonable, if inconvenient. Home repair projects were notorious for exceeding initial timelines and budgets, especially when they involved safety-critical systems like gas lines. Patricia seemed as frustrated by the delays as Mike and I were, frequently expressing her eagerness to return to her own space and her normal routines. She made a point of calling the contractors herself most mornings, pushing for faster completion while maintaining her role as an actively involved homeowner rather than a passive victim of circumstances. During the third week of her stay, I began noticing small changes in our household dynamics that seemed insignificant individually, but created a cumulative sense of subtle displacement. Patricia had gradually taken over most meal planning and preparation, claiming that she enjoyed cooking and wanted to contribute meaningfully to our household expenses. While I appreciated not having to think about dinner after long days of client work, I found myself missing the collaborative cooking sessions that Mike and I had always enjoyed together. She'd also begun rearranging items in the kitchen and common areas, always with thoughtful explanations about improved efficiency or better organization. The changes were objectively improvements in most cases, but they created an odd feeling of being a guest in my own home, as if the house were slowly adapting to Patricia's preferences rather than maintaining the atmosphere that Mike and I had created together. Most noticeably, Patricia had developed a routine of collecting the mail each afternoon, sorting through everything before leaving our correspondence on the kitchen counter. She explained that she wanted to be helpful and that watching for the mail gave her something purposeful to do during her long days at home. The gesture seemed considerate, even though it meant I no longer had the simple pleasure of opening my own mailbox and reviewing the day's deliveries at my own pace. These adjustments felt minor in the context of providing temporary housing for a family member in crisis. Every family has its rhythms and preferences, and successful cohabitation always requires some degree of compromise and flexibility. Patricia was making genuine efforts to be helpful rather than burdensome, and her contributions to household management were objectively valuable. If anything, I felt guilty for noticing these small changes at all, since they seemed petty compared to the larger gesture of hospitality we were providing. Mike seemed less aware of the gradual shifts in our daily routines, possibly because his work travel schedule meant he was home fewer evenings than usual during Patricia's stay. When he was present, he appeared pleased by the enhanced domestic efficiency and the opportunity to spend additional time with his mother. Their relationship had always been close, but the extended visit was allowing them to reconnect in ways that his busy work schedule normally prevented. The fourth week brought our first real tension point when a potential new client wanted to schedule an in-person consultation at my home office. I'd been building a relationship with a local nonprofit organization that needed comprehensive marketing, strategy development, and the executive director preferred to meet at my workspace rather than in the more formal environment of their boardroom. This type of personalized service had always been one of my competitive advantages as an independent consultant, allowing clients to see my creative process and work environment while maintaining the comfortable informality that often led to more productive brainstorming sessions. When I mentioned the upcoming meeting to Patricia, her reaction was surprisingly strong. She worried that having strangers in the house would compromise her privacy and security, especially given her vulnerable situation as someone temporarily displaced from her own home. She suggested that I could easily meet the client at a coffee shop or restaurant instead, arguing that professional meetings belonged in professional settings rather than residential spaces. "I'm sure your grandmother never intended for business meetings to happen in her lovely home," Patricia said, invoking my grandmother's memory in a way that felt both manipulative and surprisingly hurtful. "This house has always been a sanctuary for family, not a commercial space." The comment stung because it questioned not only my professional practices, but also my respect for my grandmother's legacy. Grandma Rose had always supported my entrepreneurial ambitions, often expressing pride in my independence and business acumen. She'd specifically encouraged me to use the house in whatever way would best support my career goals. Understanding that modern work often required more flexibility than traditional employment models provided. Mike, caught between his wife's professional needs and his mother's comfort concerns, tried to find a diplomatic solution by suggesting that Patricia could simply stay in her room during the client meeting. But Patricia's distress seemed genuine, and her concerns about privacy and security weren't entirely unreasonable given her current circumstances. In the interest of family harmony, I agreed to move the meeting to a local cafe, though the change required me to bring all my presentation materials and samples in a portable format that was less impressive than my usual in-office setup. The key? Client meeting went well despite the less ideal environment, but the incident established a precedent that would prove problematic as Patricia's stay continued to extend beyond anyone's original expectations. The timeline for her house repairs had now stretched into its second month, with increasingly complex explanations about permit delays, material shortages, and the discovery of additional problems that required attention before the original gas leak could be properly addressed. Patricia seemed as frustrated as Mike and I were by the extended timeline, regularly expressing her desire to return home and resume her normal life. She'd begun talking about the possibility of finding a short-term rental apartment if the repairs stretched much longer, though she worried about the expense and the hassle of multiple moves. "I hate being such a burden on you both," she'd say whenever the topic of timeline came up. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you invited me to stay for a few days." Her apparent guilt about the extended visit made it difficult to express any frustration about the impact on our routines and space. Patricia was clearly doing her best to be a considerate houseguest, and the delays were presumably beyond her control. Complaining about the inconvenience would have seemed selfish and unsympathetic given her circumstances. As we moved into the third month of Patricia's residency, I began to notice more significant changes in both our household dynamics and my business operations. Several potential clients had requested in-home consultations, a service that had become increasingly important to my marketing strategy as competition in the consulting field continued to intensify. Each time, I found myself explaining that my home office wasn't available for meetings due to family circumstances, then suggesting alternative locations that never quite provided the same professional impression or creative atmosphere. Patricia had also begun offering suggestions about my work schedule and client management practices. Observations she claimed were based on overhearing my phone conversations and video calls from other parts of the house. She worried that I was working too many hours and taking on too much stress, advice that came from a place of apparent concern, but felt increasingly intrusive as it became more frequent and specific. "That client who called this morning seemed very demanding," she might say after I'd finished a challenging negotiation about project scope and timeline. "Are you sure they're worth the aggravation? You have so many other opportunities." The she comments were always framed as concern for my well-being, but they began to feel like subtle pressure to limit my professional ambitions in favor of a more manageable, less demanding workload. Patricia had grown up in an era when women's careers were often viewed as secondary to family responsibilities, and while she never directly criticized my work ethic, her suggestions consistently pointed towards scaling back rather than growing my consulting practice. Meanwhile, Mike's work demands had intensified with a major product launch that required additional travel and longer hours. He felt guilty about being away so much while his mother was staying with us, but he also appreciated that Patricia and I were developing a closer relationship through our extended time together. From his perspective, his mother's presence was actually helping our household function more smoothly, since she was handling many domestic tasks that would otherwise fall to me during his busy periods. This interpretation wasn't entirely wrong. Patricia's contributions to cooking, cleaning, and general household management were substantial and valuable. But Mike wasn't home enough to observe the more subtle ways that our house was gradually reorganizing itself around Patricia's preferences and routines, rather than maintaining the balance that he and I had established over our years of marriage. The shift was most noticeable in the kitchen, where Patricia had systematically rearranged everything from dish storage to spice organization, according to her own logic and preferences. She always had reasonable explanations for the changes, usually related to efficiency or safety, but the cumulative effect was that I often couldn't find things in my own kitchen without asking Patricia for guidance. More troubling was her increasing involvement in my mail and personal correspondence. What had begun as a helpful gesture of collecting and sorting the daily mail had evolved into Patricia opening and reviewing items she deemed important or time-sensitive. She justified this by explaining that she wanted to help me stay organized and avoid missing anything critical while I was focused on work demands. "I noticed you got something from the county assessor's office," she might mention casually. "I put it on your desk since it looked official." I hope that was the right thing to do. The fact that she'd clearly opened and read my mail was disturbing, but Patricia's manner was so helpful and innocent that directly confronting her about it felt like an overreaction. She was obviously trying to be useful, and her knowledge of the mail's contents could reasonably be explained by her natural curiosity, rather than deliberate snooping. As Patricia's stay stretched toward its 4th month, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable with the changes in our household dynamics, but I struggled to articulate exactly what was bothering me. Patricia was unfailingly polite, helpful, and considerate in all the obvious ways. She contributed financially to groceries and utilities, maintained her own space immaculately, and consistently expressed gratitude for our hospitality. On paper, she was an ideal houseguest who was making the best of a difficult situation. Yet I felt increasingly like a visitor in my own home, constantly adjusting my routines and preferences to accommodate Patricia's more established and confident approach to household management. She had decades more experience running a household than I did, and her suggestions were usually objectively improvements to our domestic efficiency. But the cumulative effect was a subtle erosion of my authority and comfort in the space that was supposed to be my sanctuary and workplace. The situation reached a breaking point on a cold Tuesday morning in February when I discovered Patricia in my home office, seated at my desk with several official-looking documents spread in front of her. She was speaking quietly into her cell phone, taking notes on a legal pad while referencing what appeared to be property-related paperwork. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, Patricia quickly ended her phone call and began gathering the documents with apparent embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Jessica," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I was just trying to help you with some paperwork that looked important. I hope you don't mind." Among the papers I could see on my desk were documents related to my property taxes, homeowner's insurance, and what looked like mortgage information, though I'd paid off Grandma Rose's house years earlier and shouldn't have had any current mortgage paperwork. The sight of Patricia handling my confidential financial documents in my private workspace crossed a boundary that I hadn't even realized needed explicit protection. "What paperwork were you trying to help me with?" I asked, working to keep my voice calm despite the alarm bells going off in my head. Patricia's explanation was rambling and vague, mentioning something about property assessments and insurance reviews that she thought might need my attention. She claimed to have experience with real estate matters from managing her own home and her late husband's business interests, so she'd thought she could save me time by reviewing everything and summarizing the key points. The explanation felt hollow and evasive, particularly given the private nature of the documents she'd been handling. More concerning was the phone call she'd ended so abruptly when I appeared, which suggested she'd been discussing my personal, financial information with someone outside our household. For the first time since Patricia had moved in, I felt genuinely angry rather than just mildly uncomfortable. This was my home, my office, and my private information, and her presence here was supposed to be temporary and minimally disruptive. Instead, she'd been systematically inserting herself into every aspect of my personal and professional life, always with helpful explanations that made direct confrontation seem unreasonable. As I stood in my violated office space, looking at my private documents scattered across my own desk, I realized that Patricia's extended stay had never really been about a gas leak emergency. This was something else entirely, something more calculated and deliberate than a series of unfortunate repair delays. The question was, what exactly was Patricia planning, and how long had she been working toward whatever goal required access to my personal financial information and property documents? That evening, after Patricia had gone to bed and Mike was reviewing reports in the living room, I quietly returned to my office to examine exactly which documents she'd been handling. What I found made my stomach drop. The papers weren't just random property-related items. They were specifically focused on ownership documentation, property values, and legal processes I didn't recognize. Among the scattered documents was a folder I'd never seen before, containing printouts from real estate websites showing recent home sales in our neighborhood. Someone had been researching comparable property values, noting square footage, lot sizes, and final sale prices in meticulous handwritten notes that I recognized as Patricia's careful script. There were also printed articles about property inheritance laws in Texas, reverse mortgages, and something called adverse possession that I'd never heard of, but that sounded ominous. Most disturbing was a yellow legal pad filled with what appeared to be calculations, mortgage amounts, monthly payments, and timelines that seemed to correspond to different financing scenarios. At the top of one page, someone had written, "Jessica Thompson Property Assessment," in Patricia's handwriting, followed by a series of numbers that roughly matched what I knew to be my home's current market value. I photographed everything with my phone before carefully replacing the documents exactly as I'd found them, though my hands were shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Patricia had been conducting some kind of detailed financial analysis of my property, but for what purpose? The research suggested a level of planning and intention that went far beyond casual curiosity about real estate values. Unable to sleep, that night, I spent hours researching the legal terms I'd seen in Patricia's documents. Adverse possession, I learned, was a legal concept that allowed someone to claim ownership of property under certain specific circumstances involving continuous occupation and maintenance. Reverse mortgages were financial products that allowed homeowners to borrow against their property's equity, though they were typically designed for elderly homeowners facing financial hardship. Neither concept seemed directly applicable to my situation, but the fact that Patricia was researching them suggested she was exploring legal avenues related to property ownership and control. Combined with her systematic insertion into my personal affairs and her unexplained delays in returning to her own home, a deeply troubling picture was beginning to emerge. The next morning brought another unsettling discovery. While making coffee, I noticed that Patricia had organized the kitchen junk drawer with her characteristic efficiency, but she'd also removed several items that I kept there for convenience. Among the missing items were spare keys to various doors and cabinets throughout the house, including the key to my office file cabinet where I stored important documents and financial records. When I asked Patricia about the missing keys, she claimed she'd simply consolidated them in a more logical location for better security. She produced a small key organizer from her purse, containing not only my missing keys, but several others I didn't recognize, all labeled in her neat handwriting with descriptions like office cabinet, basement storage, and master bedroom, dresser. "I hope you don't mind," she said with that same helpful smile that was beginning to feel more sinister than considerate. I thought it would be safer to keep all the important keys in one place, rather than scattered around where anyone could find them. I used to do the same thing in my own home before the repairs started. The explanation sounded reasonable on its surface, but the reality was that Patricia had systematically collected access to every locked space in my house without asking permission. She now controlled entry to my private documents, personal belongings, and confidential business materials. The key organizer in her purse represented a level of control over my living space that felt deeply invasive. More concerning was her casual reference to anyone finding the keys, as if my own home weren't secure, or as if there were strangers regularly moving through our private spaces. Patricia was the only person who'd been alone in the house with unsupervised access to these areas, which meant her security concerns were either paranoid or deliberately misleading. That afternoon, while Patricia was out running errands, I decided to conduct my own investigation of her temporary living space. I felt guilty about invading her privacy, but her behavior had raised too many red flags to ignore. If she was planning something that could affect my property or financial security, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The guest bedroom revealed meticulous organization that bordered on the obsessive. Patricia's clothing was arranged by color and season, her toiletries lined up with military precision, and her medications sorted in a weekly pill organizer that suggested a level of permanence inconsistent with temporary housing. But it was the contents of her nightstand drawer that truly alarmed me. Inside, I found a thick folder containing what appeared to be comprehensive research on my personal and financial history. There were printed copies of my social media profiles, including photos and posts dating back several years. There were screenshots of my business website and client testimonials, along with handwritten notes analyzing my professional reputation and income potential. Most shocking was a detailed timeline of my relationship with Mike, including dates of our engagement, wedding, and major life events, all annotated with comments about my family background and inheritance history. Patricia had been conducting surveillance on my life with the thoroughness of a private investigator, documenting information that went far beyond what any reasonable mother-in-law would need or want to know. At the bottom of the folder, I found copies of public records that Patricia had apparently obtained through online searches or government databases. These included my grandmother's death certificate, the probate records for her estate, and the deed transfer that had made me the sole owner of the house. Someone had highlighted specific sections of these documents, particularly the parts dealing with property ownership and inheritance laws. The most disturbing item was a handwritten list titled Jessica Vulnerabilities and Opportunities. The list included personal information like my lack of close family members, my financial dependence, on freelance income, and what Patricia described as my conflict avoidance tendencies and people-pleasing behaviors. Reading her clinical assessment of my personality weaknesses felt like a violation that went beyond mere privacy invasion. Under the Opportunities section, Patricia had noted my work-from-home schedule, my husband's frequent travel, and my emotional attachment to family harmony. She'd also written property deed sole ownership, no marital property protections, and limited legal knowledge, unlikely to seek professional advice quickly. The document read like a strategic analysis of how to manipulate someone, complete with identified weaknesses and optimal approaches for exploitation. Patricia hadn't moved in with us because of a housing emergency. She'd been planning some kind of long-term operation that required intimate access to my personal life and property. As I photographed the contents of the folder with trembling hands, I tried to process the magnitude of what I was discovering. Patricia had been lying to us from the beginning, conducting surveillance on me for months, or possibly years before creating the gas leak emergency that justified moving into my home. Every helpful gesture, every considerate action, every expression of gratitude had been part of an elaborate performance designed to gain my trust while she worked toward some hidden objective. The question that terrified me most was what she was ultimately planning to do with all this information and access. The research into property laws and reverse mortgages suggested she was exploring ways to gain control over my house, but the specific mechanism remained unclear. Was she planning to claim ownership somehow? Was she trying to force me into some kind of financial arrangement? Or was this part of a larger scheme that I hadn't yet uncovered? That evening, I struggled to maintain normal conversation over dinner, while my mind raced with the implications of what I'd discovered. Patricia seemed completely at ease, chatting about her day and asking about my work with the same apparent interest she'd shown for months. Her performance was so convincing that I found myself questioning whether I'd misinterpreted the evidence, whether there might be innocent explanations for her behavior that I was missing in my growing paranoia. But the photographs on my phone didn't lie, and the systematic nature of her research couldn't be explained away as casual curiosity or helpful concern. Patricia was running a sophisticated con game, and I was her primary target. When Mike returned from his business trip 2 days later, I debated whether to share my discoveries with him immediately. Part of me wanted his support and validation, but another part worried about his reaction. Patricia was his mother, and their relationship had always been close. Would he believe that the woman who'd raised him was capable of such elaborate deception and manipulation? I decided to gather more evidence before making any accusations, partly to strengthen my case, but mostly to give myself time to figure out how to handle the situation without destroying my marriage. Mike loved his mother deeply, and any confrontation about her behavior would inevitably become a test of his loyalty and trust in me versus his lifelong bond with her. Meanwhile, Patricia's behavior became even more concerning as she seemed to sense my growing suspicion. She began asking more direct questions about my work schedule, my client meetings, and my business finances. She expressed concern about my income stability and suggested that I might benefit from more traditional employment that would provide better security and benefits. "Freelance work is so unpredictable," she'd say while we prepared dinner together. "What would happen if you got sick or injured and couldn't work? You don't have any safety net beyond what Mike provides." The comments were ostensibly about financial planning, but they felt like subtle pressure to make myself more dependent on Mike's income and less confident in my professional abilities. Patricia was systematically undermining my sense of financial security while positioning herself as a concerned advisor who only wanted what was best for our family. She also began making suggestions about home improvements and renovations that would add value to the property. These conversations always included detailed discussions of costs, financing options, and the potential return on investment for various upgrades. Patricia seemed remarkably knowledgeable about home equity loans, refinancing options, and other financial products that could affect property ownership. "This house has so much potential," she'd say while examining the kitchen or bathrooms with a critical eye. "With the right improvements, you could probably increase its value by $30,000 or $40,000. Have you ever thought about tapping into the equity to fund some renovations?" The suggestions were presented as helpful financial advice, but I now understood them as potential attempts to convince me to take on debt secured by my property. If I borrowed against the house for renovations, Patricia might have opportunities to insert herself into the financial arrangements or create complications that could affect my ownership rights. Most troubling was her increasing interest in my daily schedule and activities. Patricia began asking detailed questions about my client meetings, my errands, and my social commitments. She claimed to be interested in my life and work, but the level of detail she sought felt more like surveillance than genuine curiosity. "Will you be out long this afternoon?" she might ask when I mentioned a client meeting. "I was thinking of doing some cleaning in your office while you're gone, just to help keep things organized." The offers to help with my workspace were particularly concerning, given what I'd discovered about her previous invasion of my private documents. Patricia was looking for opportunities to access my office when I wasn't there to observe her activities, which suggested she had ongoing plans that required privacy and secrecy. I began varying my schedule unpredictably and taking my most important documents with me when I left the house. But these precautions felt insufficient against someone who was living in my home with unrestricted access to my personal space and belongings. Patricia had already demonstrated her ability to conduct detailed research and surveillance without my knowledge, and there was no telling what else she might be planning. The breaking point came during the third week of February when I returned home unexpectedly from a canceled client meeting to find Patricia in my office again, this time speaking on the phone while examining documents from my locked file cabinet. The key organizer from her purse was sitting on my desk, and she had clearly been using my keys to access confidential materials. When she saw me in the doorway, Patricia quickly ended her phone call and began gathering papers with obvious embarrassment. But not before I heard her say something about property transfer timelines and legal requirements for residency claims. "I can explain," she said, avoiding eye contact as she hastily organized the scattered documents. "I was just trying to help you understand some legal matters that might affect the house." But I was no longer interested in Patricia's explanations. Her pattern of invasion, surveillance, and manipulation had become undeniable, and whatever she was planning clearly involved my property ownership in ways that could threaten my financial security and legal rights. "Patricia," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the fury building inside me, "I need you to explain exactly what you're doing with my private documents and who you were speaking with about my property." For the first time since she'd moved in, Patricia's helpful facade cracked slightly, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. "I think you're overreacting, Jessica," she said, her tone shifting from apologetic to mildly condescending. "I'm trying to help you navigate some complex legal issues that you might not understand on your own." The patronizing response confirmed my worst fears about Patricia's true intentions and her assessment of my capabilities. She wasn't trying to help me. She was working against me, using her access to my home and documents to pursue some agenda that she believed I was too naive or incompetent to recognize or stop. As I stood in my violated office, watching Patricia continue to handle my private papers with casual familiarity, I realized that the woman I'd welcomed into my home 4 months earlier had been playing a role from the very beginning. The grateful, displaced mother-in-law was a carefully constructed character designed to gain my trust and access, while she worked toward objectives that remained hidden but were clearly not in my best interests. The question was no longer whether Patricia was running some kind of scam. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was what exactly she was trying to accomplish, and how much damage she might have already done to my financial security and property rights, while I'd been naively providing her with food, shelter, and unlimited access to my personal life. Standing there in my own office, surrounded by my scattered documents and Patricia's transparent lies, I felt a mixture of rage and determination that I'd never experienced before. This was my home, inherited from the grandmother who'd loved and supported me, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me through manipulation and deception. Whatever Patricia was planning, whatever legal maneuvers she'd been researching, whatever claims she thought she could make on my property, I was going to stop her. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against and how to protect myself from someone who'd proven herself capable of elaborate deception and systematic manipulation. The real fight was just beginning, and I was finally ready to stop being the accommodating hostess and start being the defender of my own home and future. I spent the weekend in a state of barely contained anxiety, watching Patricia move through my house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, while I felt increasingly like an intruder in my own home. Every interaction felt loaded with hidden meaning, every helpful gesture seemed calculated, and every smile appeared to conceal motives I was only beginning to understand. Mike returned from his latest business trip on Sunday evening, exhausted from a week of client meetings and eager to relax at home. His easy comfort with Patricia's presence, the way he automatically included her in our dinner conversation and evening plans, highlighted how completely she'd integrated herself into our lives. To him, his mother was simply an extended house guest, dealing with unfortunate home repairs. He had no idea that the woman serving him homemade soup had been conducting reconnaissance on his wife for months. I waited until Monday morning, after Patricia had left for one of her mysterious errands, to approach Mike about my discoveries. I'd rehearsed the conversation countless times, trying to find words that would convey the seriousness of the situation without sounding paranoid or vindictive. The evidence on my phone was compelling, but I knew that Mike's first instinct would be to defend his mother and find innocent explanations for her behavior. "We need to talk about your mother," I began, as Mike poured his coffee, trying to keep my voice calm and factual. "I've discovered some things that suggest her stay here isn't what we've been led to believe." Mike looked up with the slightly wary expression he wore when family tensions were brewing, the look of someone preparing to mediate between two important women in his life. "What kind of things?" he asked carefully. I showed him the photographs I'd taken of Patricia's research files, explaining how I'd found them and what they seemed to represent. Mike studied the images on my phone screen with growing confusion, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as he processed what he was seeing. "This is research about you," he said slowly, zooming in on the detailed timeline of our relationship. "Why would Mom have this level of information about your background and finances?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out," I replied, relief flooding through me at his recognition that the situation was abnormal. "But there's more." I walked him through everything I'd discovered over the past week: the property law research, the key collection, the repeated invasions of my office, the phone calls about legal matters she wouldn't explain. Mike listened, with increasing alarm, occasionally asking questions but mostly absorbing the magnitude of what his mother had been doing under our roof. The gas leak story was a lie, I concluded, showing him the final piece of evidence I'd gathered over the weekend. I called the utility company in Round Rock, pretending to be a concerned neighbor asking about safety issues in her area. They have no record of any gas leak reports or service calls at her address in the past 6 months. Mike stared at this information for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he processed the implications. "So, she lied about the emergency to get into our house," he said finally. "But why? What's she trying to accomplish?" "I think she's trying to establish some kind of legal claim on the property," I said, sharing my analysis of the adverse possession and property law research. "Or maybe she's planning to manipulate me into taking on debt secured by the house so she can create financial complications. I don't know the specific endgame, but everything points to her wanting control over this property." Mike was quiet, For several minutes, scrolling through the evidence again with the methodical attention he brought to complex business problems, I could see him struggling to reconcile the loving mother he'd known his entire life with the calculating schemer revealed in the photographs. "We need to confront her," he said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment and determination. "This stops today." When Patricia returned from her errands that afternoon, Mike and I were waiting for her in the living room with printed copies of the evidence spread across the coffee table. She walked in with her usual cheerful greeting, carrying shopping bags and chatting about the beautiful weather, but she stopped short when she saw our serious expressions and the documents laid out like an accusation. "Is everything all right?" she asked, though her tone had already shifted from casual to cautious. "Sit down, Mom," Mike said, his voice carrying an authority I'd rarely heard him use with his mother. "We need to discuss what you've been doing since you moved in here." Patricia's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, resignation, before settling into a mask of confused innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, taking a seat across from us, but keeping her purse clutched tightly in her hands. Mike picked up the printed timeline of our relationship, the one filled with Patricia's handwritten notes about my family history and financial vulnerabilities. "Can you explain why you have detailed research files about Jessica's personal life and property ownership?" Patricia glanced at the document, and I saw the moment when she realized the extent of what we'd discovered. Her helpful facade wavered slightly, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath, but she quickly recovered her composure. "I was trying to understand Jessica better," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "When you marry someone, you become part of their family, and I wanted to make sure I was being supportive in the right ways. Is it wrong for a mother-in-law to take an interest in her son's wife?" The explanation was so smoothly delivered, so reasonable on its surface, that for a moment, I wondered if I'd been overreacting. But Mike held up another document, the list of my vulnerabilities and opportunities, and Patricia's innocent act became harder to maintain. "This isn't taking an interest, Mom," Mike said, his disappointment evident in his voice. "This is surveillance. You've been studying Jessica like she's a target for some kind of operation." Patricia's expression hardened slightly, though she maintained her posture of wronged innocence. "I'm trying to help this family make smart decisions about your future," she said, her tone becoming more defensive. "This house represents a significant financial asset that needs proper management and protection." "Protection from what?" I asked, finally finding my voice in this surreal confrontation. "From poor decisions that could put your security at risk," Patricia replied, looking directly at me with an intensity that felt almost threatening. "You're young and inexperienced with property ownership and financial planning. This house could provide security for your entire future if it's handled correctly." The condescending tone and presumptuous attitude revealed the core of Patricia's mindset. She saw me as incompetent to manage my own inheritance and believed she had the right to intervene for what she considered my own good. The research and surveillance weren't malicious in her mind. They were necessary preparation for saving me from my own inadequacies. "The gas leak was fabricated," Mike said, showing her the utility company records. "You lied to get into our house. Why?" For the first time, Patricia's composure cracked completely. She looked between Mike and me with something approaching desperation, as if realizing that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing beyond repair. "I needed time," she admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Time to assess the situation and figure out how to help you both understand what you're dealing with." "What situation?" I demanded, anger finally overriding my discomfort with confrontation. "My grandmother left me this house because she trusted me to take care of it. What gives you the right to decide that I need your intervention?" Patricia straightened in her chair, and I saw a flash of the steely determination that had probably served her well throughout her life. "Your grandmother didn't understand the complexities of modern property ownership and estate planning," she said with Conviction. This house is your most valuable asset, but you're treating it like a playground for your little business instead of recognizing its potential for long-term financial security. The dismissal of my work as a little business stung, but it also clarified Patricia's fundamental misunderstanding of my priorities and capabilities. She saw my home-based consulting practice as a hobby rather than a legitimate career, and she viewed my emotional attachment to the house as naive sentimentality that needed to be managed by more practical adults. "What were you planning to do?" Mike asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What was the end goal of all this research and surveillance?" Patricia hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her options, before apparently deciding that honesty might be her best remaining strategy. "I was exploring options for maximizing the property's financial potential," she said carefully. "There are several legal mechanisms that could provide better security for your future. Reverse mortgages, equity lines of credit, even partial ownership transfers that could offer tax advantages and estate planning benefits." The clinical language couldn't disguise what she was really describing: plans to encumber my property with debt or complicate its ownership in ways that would benefit her agenda rather than my interests. She'd been researching methods to insert herself into my property ownership, creating financial or legal arrangements that would give her control or claim over my inheritance. "You were planning to steal my house," I said, the words feeling strange and surreal even as I spoke them. "I was planning to help you use your house intelligently," Patricia corrected, her tone becoming sharp with frustration. "You're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity while struggling with the inconsistent income of freelance work. It's wasteful and short-sighted." The conversation continued for another hour, with Patricia alternately defending her actions as helpful family intervention and revealing the depth of her research into legal methods for affecting property ownership. She'd consulted with lawyers about adverse possession claims, researched the requirements for establishing residency for legal purposes, and explored the possibility of claiming caregiver rights that might grant her some form of property interest. Most disturbing was her detailed knowledge of my financial vulnerabilities, the seasonal fluctuations in my consulting income, my lack of traditional employee benefits, my limited family support network. She'd identified every weakness in my personal and professional situation with the thoroughness of someone preparing for a hostile takeover. "I've been trying to protect you from your own naivety," she insisted, as Mike and I stared at her in disbelief. "This house could set you up for life if you use it strategically instead of clinging to romantic notions about family legacy." By the end of the confrontation, Patricia had revealed herself as someone who fundamentally believed that her judgment was superior to mine and that my resistance to her plans was evidence of immaturity rather than legitimate autonomy. She showed no remorse for the deception, surveillance, or invasion of privacy, instead framing these actions as necessary steps in helping me overcome my own limitations. "I want you out of my house," I said when it became clear that Patricia would never acknowledge the wrongness of her behavior. "Today." Patricia's expression shifted to something I'd never seen before: cold calculation mixed with barely controlled rage. "This house is wasted on you," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea what you're throwing away with your stubborn pride." "Get out," Mike said, his voice carrying a finality that surprised both Patricia and me. "Pack your things and leave, now." For a moment, I thought Patricia might refuse or escalate the confrontation into something even uglier. She sat rigid in her chair, staring at both of us with undisguised hostility, and I realized that this was the real Patricia, not the helpful houseguest or the concerned mother-in-law, but someone who felt entitled to control other people's lives and assets according to her own vision of proper management. "Fine," she said finally, rising from her chair with dignity that seemed almost theatrical. "But you're making a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your lives." As Patricia went to pack her belongings, Mike and I sat in stunned silence, processing what we'd just learned about someone we thought we knew. The woman who'd raised Mike, who'd been part of our family for 8 years, had been systematically working to undermine my autonomy and potentially steal my inheritance through legal manipulation and financial coercion. "I'm sorry," Mike said. Finally, his voice heavy with guilt and embarrassment. I had no idea she was capable of this. "Neither did I replied, feeling emotionally drained by the confrontation and the revelations. "But at least now we know the truth." Patricia emerged from the guest bedroom an hour later with her suitcases and bags, looking every inch the dignified woman who'd been wrongly accused and unfairly ejected from her temporary home. She handed me the key organizer from her purse. Without comment, her expression cold and distant. "You'll understand someday," she said as she reached the front door. "When your little business fails and you lose this house because you were too proud to accept help from people who actually understand finance and property management." With that parting shot, Patricia walked out of our house and, I thought, out of our lives. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as I watched her drive away, grateful that the deception was over but still processing the magnitude of what had been happening under my own roof. Mike helped me change all the locks that evening, a practical precaution that also felt symbolically important. As we worked together to secure our home, I felt like we were reclaiming our space from someone who'd been occupying it under false pretenses for months. "What do you think she'll do now?" I asked as we tested the new deadbolt on the front door. "I don't know," Mike admitted. "But I don't think this is over. Mom doesn't give up easily when she thinks she's right." His prediction proved accurate sooner than either of us expected. The next morning brought the first sign that Patricia's departure was a strategic retreat rather than a defeated surrender. When I went to collect the mail, I found an envelope addressed to me from a law firm I'd never heard of, containing a letter that made my blood run cold. The letter, written on expensive legal letterhead, informed me that Patricia Thompson had consulted with their firm regarding potential claims related to property ownership and residency rights. While they weren't making any specific threats at this time, they wanted me to be aware that Mrs. Thompson had established legal residency at my address and had been contributing to household expenses and property maintenance for an extended period. The letter continued with carefully worded language about adverse possession laws, tenant rights, and the complex legal issues that could arise when property ownership was disputed. They suggested that I might benefit from consulting with my own attorney to ensure that I fully understood my rights and obligations regarding the property in question. Reading the letter in my kitchen, I realized that Patricia's months of research and planning had been preparation for exactly this moment. She'd anticipated being discovered and confronted, and she'd positioned herself legally for whatever came next. The helpful houseguest persona had been cover for establishing the kind of legal presence that might support future claims on my property. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. And now Patricia was playing with professional legal support while I was still trying to understand the rules. The lawyer's letter sat on my kitchen counter like a coiled snake, its legal jargon barely masking the threat beneath. I read it 3 times before the full implications sank in, and with each reading, my initial fear transformed into something far more powerful, a cold, determined fury that Patricia had underestimated completely. She thought she was dealing with someone too naive and conflict-averse to fight back effectively. She'd studied my personality, cataloged my weaknesses, and planned her strategy around the assumption that I would crumble under legal pressure, rather than defend what was rightfully mine. What Patricia hadn't counted on was that threatening my grandmother's house, the symbol of everything Rose had worked for and believed in, would awaken a strength in me that I didn't even know existed. I called my friend Amanda that morning, needing to talk through the situation with someone who knew me well enough to provide honest perspective. Amanda was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and while property disputes weren't her specialty, she understood legal tactics and could help me navigate the next steps. "She's trying to intimidate you into a settlement," Amanda said after I'd explained the entire situation. "These lawyers probably told her that most people cave when they receive official legal correspondence, especially if they can't afford prolonged litigation. But I have documentation of everything, I protested. The surveillance files, the fake emergency, the systematic deception. Doesn't that prove she has no legitimate claim? It proves she's been dishonest, but that doesn't automatically invalidate every argument her lawyers might make, Amanda explained patiently. Property law can be complex, and even frivolous claims can be expensive and time-consuming to fight. That's what they're counting on. Amanda recommended that I consult with David Chen, a property attorney whose firm had a reputation for aggressive defense of homeowner rights. She'd worked with him on several cases and trusted his judgment about when to negotiate versus when to fight. I called David's office that afternoon and managed to get an appointment for the following morning. Spending the evening preparing documentation felt like getting ready for war, but I approached it with methodical determination rather than panic. Patricia had been planning this confrontation for months, but I had advantages she didn't fully appreciate. Complete documentation of her deception, a clear legal title to the property, and a willingness to fight that she'd dramatically underestimated. David Chen turned out to be exactly what I needed, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an immediate grasp of the situation's legal complexities. He reviewed Patricia's lawyer's letter along with all the evidence I'd gathered, asking pointed questions about timelines, witnesses, and documentation. "This is harassment disguised as legal positioning," he said after studying everything carefully. "She's established residency at your address, yes, but under false pretenses and through deliberate deception. That undermines any legitimate claims she might try to make." "What's her endgame?" I asked. "What's she actually trying to accomplish?" David leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. "My guess is she wants to force you into a financial settlement to make her go away. She'll probably claim she's entitled to compensation for improvements she made to the property, reimbursement for expenses she incurred while living there, maybe even damages for being wrongfully evicted from her established residence." The strategy was both simpler and more cynical than I'd imagined. Patricia wasn't necessarily trying to steal my house outright. She was trying to extort money from me by creating legal complications that would be expensive to resolve through litigation. "What if I refuse to negotiate?" I asked. "Then we fight," David said with a slight smile. "And based on what you've shown me, I think we'd win decisively. The question is whether you're prepared for what that fight might involve." He explained that defending against Patricia's claims would require documenting everything, potentially involving Mike as a witness, and being prepared for Patricia to escalate her tactics as the legal pressure increased. She'd already demonstrated a willingness to lie and manipulate to get what she wanted, and people like that often became more desperate and unpredictable when cornered. "I want to fight," I said without hesitation. "This is my home, and I'm not paying her a penny to stop harassing me." David nodded approvingly. "Then let's make sure she understands exactly what she's up against." The first step was a response letter to Patricia's attorneys, written in the same formal legal language but carrying a very different message. David's letter laid out the complete timeline of Patricia's deception, referenced the surveillance and research files as evidence of premeditation, and made it clear that any attempt to pursue legal action would result in counterclaims for harassment, trespass, and potentially fraud. More importantly, the letter included copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, demonstrating that we had comprehensive documentation of Patricia's scheme. David explained that most lawyers would advise their clients to abandon obviously losing cases rather than risk sanctions for pursuing frivolous litigation. "This should end it," he said as we finalized the response. "Unless she's completely delusional about her legal position, she'll realize that continuing this fight will only expose her to more liability." The letter went out on a Friday afternoon, and I spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended anticipation, waiting for Patricia's next move while trying to return to some semblance of normal life. Mike had been incredibly supportive throughout the legal consultation process, but I could see the strain that his mother's behavior was putting on him. He was dealing with the dual shock of discovering Patricia's deception and having to choose sides in a conflict that threatened to tear his family apart permanently. "I keep thinking about all the times she offered advice about our finances," he said as we worked in the garden that Saturday morning. "Was she gathering information even then? How long has she been planning this?" The questions haunted both of us because they highlighted how thoroughly Patricia had violated our trust and privacy. Every family dinner, every casual conversation about our plans and dreams, every moment of apparent maternal concern had potentially been part of her intelligence-gathering operation. The answer came sooner than either of us expected, in the form of Patricia herself appearing at our front door on Sunday evening. She looked composed and determined, carrying a small briefcase that suggested this wasn't a social call. "I'd like to speak with both of you," she said when I answered the door, her tone formal and businesslike. "I think we can resolve this situation without involving lawyers any further." Against my better judgment, I let her in, though I immediately called David to let him know that Patricia was at the house attempting to negotiate directly. He advised me to record the conversation if possible, and to avoid agreeing to anything without his review. Patricia sat in our living room with the same confident posture she'd maintained throughout her months of deception. But there was something different in her demeanor, a hint of desperation beneath the composed exterior that suggested David's response letter had hit its mark. "I've received some concerning correspondence from your attorney," she began, opening her briefcase and removing several documents. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions and my legal position." "There's been no misunderstanding," I replied firmly. "You lied to get into my house, conducted surveillance on my personal life, and researched ways to manipulate my property ownership. Now you're trying to extort money from me to go away." Patricia's mask of reasonableness slipped, slightly at my direct accusation. "I was trying to help you both understand the financial opportunities you were missing," she said, her voice taking on the same condescending tone I'd heard during our confrontation. "This house could provide security for your entire future if it's managed properly." "By you," Mike said flatly. "You wanted to manage our property and our finances according to your vision of what's appropriate." "I wanted to prevent you from making mistakes that would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars," Patricia shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Jessica's little consulting business is never going to provide real security, and this house is too valuable to waste on someone who doesn't understand its potential." The dismissive attitude and proprietary language revealed that Patricia still believed she was in the right, that her deception and manipulation were justified by her superior understanding of financial planning. She showed no remorse for the invasion of privacy or the months of lies, instead focusing on her frustration that we weren't grateful for her unwanted intervention. "What do you want?" I asked, cutting through her rationalizations to get to the practical matter at hand. Patricia straightened in her chair and pulled out a typewritten document from her briefcase. "I'm prepared to drop any claims related to the property in exchange for reasonable compensation for the improvements I made during my residency and reimbursement for the expenses I incurred while contributing to household maintenance." She slid the document across the coffee table toward me. It was an itemized list of alleged contributions to the household, including grocery expenses, utility payments, garden maintenance, and something called property management consultation services. The total amount was $47,000. I stared at the figure in disbelief. Patricia was demanding nearly $50,000 to stop pursuing legal claims that we both knew were baseless. The grocery and utility contributions were grossly inflated. The garden maintenance consisted of suggestions rather than actual work, and the consultation services were surveillance activities conducted without my knowledge or consent. "This is extortion," I said, pushing the document back toward her. "You're demanding payment to stop harassment based on fraudulent claims. I'm offering you the opportunity to resolve this matter quietly and avoid the expense and publicity of prolonged litigation," Patricia replied with studied calm. "Property disputes can be very costly and time-consuming, especially when they involve family members." The threat was clear. Pay her nearly $50,000 or face months of legal battles that would be expensive, stressful, and potentially damaging to our family relationships and community reputation. Patricia was counting on my desire to avoid conflict and protect my privacy to make the extortion successful. "Get out," I said, standing up and moving toward the front door. "Get out of my house and don't come back." Patricia remained seated, her expression shifting to something harder and more threatening. "You're making a serious mistake, Jessica. I know things about your financial situation and your business practices that could be very damaging if they became public during litigation." The vague threat sent a chill through me, but it also crystallized my resolve. Patricia was now openly trying to blackmail me, which meant she was more desperate than she'd initially appeared. David had been right. Her legal position was weak, and she was resorting to intimidation tactics because she had no legitimate options left. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, pulling out my phone to make sure the recording app was still running. Patricia realized her mistake immediately, her face flushing as she understood that she'd crossed a line into explicit threats while being recorded. "I'm simply explaining the realities of legal proceedings," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The reality is that you have no legitimate claim on my property," I replied with growing confidence. "The reality is that you committed fraud to gain access to my home and conducted surveillance on my private life for months. The reality is that every lawyer who reviews the evidence will advise you to drop this harassment campaign before you face serious legal consequences." Patricia sat in stunned silence for a moment, apparently realizing that her intimidation tactics had backfired completely. She'd expected me to cave under legal pressure, but instead, I was becoming more determined to fight with each escalation. $47,000 is nothing compared to what prolonged litigation will cost you," she said, making one final attempt at coercion. "I'm offering you a reasonable way out of an expensive situation. The only reasonable way out is for you to leave my property and never contact me again," I said, opening the front door and gesturing for her to leave. "Any further harassment will be handled through law enforcement and the court system." Patricia finally stood up, gathering her briefcase and documents with as much dignity as she could manage. At the door, she turned back with one last attempt to regain psychological advantage. "This house will never provide the security you think it will," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who truly believed her own propaganda. "When your business fails and you lose everything, you'll remember that I tried to help you." With that final prediction of doom, Patricia walked out of my house for what I was determined would be the last time. As I locked the door behind her, I felt a sense of finality and empowerment that I'd never experienced before. The scared, accommodating woman who'd welcomed a lying house guest 4 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it. The legal harassment continued for another 6 weeks, with Patricia's lawyers sending increasingly desperate letters threatening various forms of litigation, while simultaneously hinting at possible settlements for progressively smaller amounts. David responded to each communication with detailed refutations and counter-threats that made it clear we were prepared to fight any frivolous claims while pursuing our own legal remedies for harassment and fraud. The breakthrough came when David discovered that Patricia had attempted similar schemes with 2 other family members over the past several years, using fabricated emergencies to gain access to their homes, and then creating legal complications designed to extract financial settlements. The pattern of behavior proved that this wasn't desperate improvisation, but rather Patricia's preferred method for supplementing her retirement income through targeted exploitation of family relationships. Armed with this additional evidence, David sent a final letter to Patricia's attorneys that made it clear we had documented proof of her pattern of fraudulent behavior and were prepared to pursue criminal charges in addition to civil remedies. Within a week, we received a letter from a different law firm informing us that they were no longer representing Patricia Thompson and that she would not be pursuing any further claims related to the property. The legal victory felt anticlimactic after months of stress and preparation, but it also felt complete. Patricia's attempt to extort money from me through legal intimidation had failed spectacularly, and she'd been forced to retreat without receiving a single dollar for her elaborate scheme. More importantly, the experience had transformed me in ways that went far beyond the specific legal outcome. I'd discovered reserves of strength and determination that I'd never known I possessed, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations rather than second-guessing myself out of politeness or family obligation. 6 months later, I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the window, I could see a woman I didn't recognize standing on my front porch with a clipboard and an official-looking envelope. My first thought was that Patricia had found some new legal angle to pursue, but when I opened the door, the woman introduced herself as a private investigator working for an insurance company. "I'm investigating a fraud case involving Patricia Thompson," she explained, showing me her credentials. "I understand she lived at this address for several months last year under questionable circumstances." It turned out that Patricia had been running insurance scams in addition to her property manipulation schemes, filing false claims for damage. To her own home while living with various family members she'd deceived with fabricated emergencies. The gas leak that had supposedly driven her from her house had been entirely fictional, but she'd used it to justify insurance claims for temporary housing expenses and property damage that had never occurred. My documentation of Patricia's deception and surveillance activities became crucial evidence in the insurance investigation, which ultimately resulted in criminal charges for fraud and theft. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the insurance companies she'd defrauded. The news brought a sense of closure to the entire ordeal. But more than that, it validated my decision to fight, rather than pay her extortion demands. Patricia had been a career criminal who specialized in exploiting family relationships for financial gain, and she'd chosen me as a target because she'd mistakenly believed I was too passive and naive to defend myself effectively. Today, 2 years after Patricia first appeared at my door with her fabricated emergency, my life has settled into a rhythm that feels both familiar and completely transformed. The house is still mine, legally and emotionally, but my relationship with it has deepened through the experience of nearly losing it. Every room holds memories of the months when I felt like an intruder in my own home, and every secure lock reminds me of the strength I found when everything I valued was threatened. My consulting business has grown significantly, partly because the confidence I gained from standing up to Patricia has translated into more assertive client relationships and better business decision-making. I no longer second-guess my professional instincts or accept less than I'm worth out of misplaced politeness. The woman who once apologized for scheduling client meetings in her own home office now runs strategy sessions with Fortune 500 companies, from the same converted bedroom where Patricia once conducted surveillance on my personal life. Mike and I have never spoken to Patricia again, though we occasionally hear updates about her legal troubles through extended family members. Her criminal conviction effectively ended her manipulation schemes, but it also cost her relationships, with everyone who'd previously tolerated her interference out of family loyalty. She'd finally pushed too hard against someone who was willing to push back, and the consequences had rippled through every area of her life. The experience taught me that the most dangerous predators often come disguised as helpers, and that the people who claim to know what's best for us are sometimes the ones we most need to resist. Patricia's months of research and planning had been thorough, but she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that kindness and accommodation were signs of weakness rather than strength, and that someone who avoided conflict would be unable to fight when it truly mattered. Standing in my kitchen this morning, drinking coffee and planning my day in the house my grandmother left me, I feel grateful for the hard lessons that came with Patricia's attempted theft. I learned that I'm capable of protecting what matters. To me, that family relationships don't justify accepting abuse or manipulation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's harmful behavior. The locked suitcase that had once contained Patricia's surveillance files now sits empty in my closet, a reminder of how close I came to losing everything through misplaced trust and conflict avoidance. But it's also a symbol of recovery and empowerment, proof that even the most elaborate schemes can be defeated by someone who's willing to stand up for what's rightfully theirs. My grandmother Rose would have been proud of the fight I put up for her house and her granddaughter's future. She'd raised me to be kind and accommodating, but she'd also raised me to be strong and independent. It just took Patricia's betrayal to teach me that sometimes those qualities need to work together rather than in opposition. The deed to this house is in my name, in my safe, where it belongs. And anyone who wants to take it from me will discover that I'm not the naive, conflict-averse target they might expect. I'm Jessica Thompson, and this is my home, and I'll defend it with everything I have. 3 years have passed since Patricia walked out of my life in handcuffs, and the transformation in my world extends far beyond what I could have imagined during those dark months when I felt like a prisoner in my own home. The house on Maple Street has become something entirely different from what it was during Patricia's occupation. Not just a residence, but a symbol of resilience and the headquarters of a business empire I never thought I was capable of building. The morning sunlight streams through the windows of what used to be my cramped home office, now expanded into a proper executive suite that occupies the entire converted garage space. Where Patricia once conducted her surveillance operations, I now run Luminous Consulting, a marketing firm that employs 12 people and serves clients across 3 states. The irony isn't lost on me that the woman who dismissed my work as a little business inadvertently pushed me toward achievements that exceeded even my own ambitious dreams. The expansion began during the legal battle with Patricia, when the stress and anger of fighting for my home channeled itself into a fierce determination to prove her wrong about everything. Her condescending predictions about my business failing became fuel for a growth strategy that was part professional ambition and part personal vendetta. Every new client I landed, every successful campaign I executed, every dollar of revenue I generated felt like another nail in the coffin of her narrative about my incompetence and naivety. Amanda, my paralegal friend who helped me navigate the initial legal crisis, now serves as my operations manager, having left her family law position to join what she calls the most satisfying revenge story she's ever witnessed. Her understanding of legal processes and business operations has been invaluable as we've grown from a one-woman consulting practice into a full-service marketing agency with specializations in crisis management and reputation recovery. The client roster reads like a catalog of businesses that have faced their own Patricia-like challenges: family companies dealing with internal sabotage, entrepreneurs recovering from partnership betrayals, and organizations rebuilding after trust violations. My experience with systematic deception and manipulation has become an unexpected professional asset, giving me insights into the psychology of exploitation that traditional marketing consultants simply don't possess. Mike often jokes that Patricia did us the biggest favor of our lives by revealing her true nature before she could cause permanent damage. But I know the experience changed him in ways that go beyond humor. Watching his mother's systematic betrayal of our family forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about loyalty, trust, and the obligations that come with blood relationships. The man who once automatically deferred to his mother's opinions now approaches family dynamics with a skeptical eye that serves him well in both personal and professional relationships. His own career has flourished in parallel with mine, partly because the confidence he gained from choosing his wife over his manipulative mother translated into more assertive leadership at his tech company. He was promoted to vice president of sales 18 months ago, an advancement that he attributes directly to the backbone he developed during our confrontation with Patricia. Learning to set boundaries with the most important woman in his life gave him the skills to navigate complex corporate politics with unprecedented effectiveness. Our marriage has been fundamentally transformed by surviving Patricia's assault on our family unit. The shared experience of recognizing manipulation, gathering evidence, and fighting back together created a partnership dynamic that's deeper and more authentic than anything we'd achieved during our previous years of comfortable routine. We now approach challenges as a unified team, rather than two individuals trying to balance competing loyalties and expectations. The guest bedroom where Patricia conducted her 4-month psychological warfare campaign has been converted into a proper library and reading room, with built-in bookshelves holding volumes on business strategy, legal procedures, and psychology texts that help me understand the mindset of people who exploit others for personal gain. The space has been completely renovated, painted in warm colors that erase any trace of the cold calculation Patricia brought to our home. More symbolically, the room now houses a small display case containing the key organizer Patricia used to control access to my private spaces, along with printed copies of her surveillance files and the fraudulent insurance claims that ultimately led to her imprisonment. Visitors often ask about the unusual exhibit, giving me opportunities to share the story of how someone I trusted nearly stole my entire life through patient manipulation and systematic deception. The story has become something of a cautionary tale in our community, shared at neighborhood gatherings and family events as an example of how predators can hide behind familial relationships and helpful facades. Several people have approached me over the years to share their own experiences with manipulative relatives, and I've been able to provide practical advice about documentation, legal resources, and the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong. Karen, my next-door neighbor who witnessed Patricia's comings and goings during her residency, has become one of my closest friends and most vocal supporters. She often mentions that watching me fight back against Patricia inspired her to set boundaries with her own difficult family members, including a brother who'd been financially exploiting their elderly parents through similar manipulation tactics. The ripple effects of standing up to Patricia have extended throughout our social circle, creating a network of people who are more aware of manipulation tactics and more willing to confront exploitation when they encounter it. Several couples in our neighborhood have strengthened their own relationships by discussing the lessons from our experience and establishing clearer boundaries with intrusive family members. My consulting business has grown partly through referrals from people who heard about the Patricia situation and wanted to work with someone who understood the dynamics of betrayal and recovery. The story has become part of my professional brand, demonstrating to potential clients that I know how to fight back against sophisticated attacks and emerge stronger from the experience. One of my most satisfying client relationships developed with the insurance company that prosecuted Patricia for fraud. They hired Luminous Consulting to help them develop educational materials about family-based insurance scams, using my experience as a case study in how to recognize and document suspicious behavior. Working with them to prevent other people from becoming victims of schemes like Patricia's has provided a sense of purpose that goes beyond simple business success. The financial impact of building my business in response to Patricia's threats has been substantial and deeply satisfying. The woman who told me my little consulting business would never provide real security has inadvertently inspired me to create a company valued at over $2 million, with annual revenues that exceed what most traditional employees earn in a decade. The house she tried to steal through manipulation is now one of several properties I own, including a small office building downtown and a vacation home in the hill country that serves as a retreat for strategic planning sessions. But the most meaningful transformation has been internal, in my understanding of my own capabilities and my willingness to defend what matters to me. The woman who once apologized for inconveniencing a manipulative house guest now runs board meetings with Fortune 500 executives and negotiates contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The person who avoided conflict to preserve family harmony now specializes in crisis management and reputation recovery for clients facing their own betrayals and challenges. The changes extend to smaller daily interactions as well. I no longer automatically assume that people's helpful offers are genuine. and I trust my instincts when something feels wrong rather than explaining away red flags out of politeness. The surveillance skills Patricia used against me have become tools I use to protect myself and my clients. Reading body language and analyzing motivations with an awareness that serves me well in both business and personal relationships. Patricia's attempts to contact me from prison were blocked by legal restraining orders, but I occasionally receive updates about her situation through court documents and insurance industry communications. She served her full 18-month sentence and was released under supervised probation that restricts her ability to live with family members or establish residency under false pretenses. The criminal conviction effectively ended her manipulation career, but it also left her isolated from the network of relationships she'd exploited for decades. According to the last report I received, Patricia is living in a small apartment in San Antonio, working part-time at a retail job and struggling with the financial restitution requirements that will follow her for years to come. The woman who confidently predicted my business failure and financial ruin is now dealing with the consequences of her own criminal choices, while the naive target she tried to exploit has built a life that exceeds her wildest ambitions. The contrast between our current situations provides a satisfaction that goes beyond simple revenge. Patricia's downfall was the natural consequence of her own actions and choices, while my success resulted from the strength and determination she inadvertently awakened. Her attempts to steal my security ultimately led to creating security beyond anything I'd previously imagined possible. Mike and I have discussed having children over the past year, conversations that inevitably touch on the kind of family environment we want to create and the lessons we've learned about protecting our household from toxic influences. The experience with Patricia has made us both more aware of the importance of teaching children to recognize manipulation and stand up for themselves, skills that we wish we'd developed earlier in our own lives. The house where Patricia conducted her surveillance campaign has become a gathering place for friends and colleagues, hosting strategy sessions, dinner parties, and celebrations that fill the space with positive energy and genuine relationships. The dining room where she first appeared with her fabricated emergency story now hosts monthly networking events for women entrepreneurs, creating connections and opportunities that honor the memory of my grandmother Rose while building on the foundation she provided. The garden where Patricia pretended to offer helpful advice has been expanded into a full landscape design that includes a small meditation area where I often sit in the mornings, planning my day and reflecting on the journey from victim to victor. The space represents growth and renewal, transformation that honors both the challenges I've overcome and the opportunities that emerged from nearly losing everything I valued. David Chen, the attorney who helped me defeat Patricia's legal harassment, has become both a trusted advisor and a close friend, providing counsel for business contracts and personal legal matters with the same aggressive competence he brought to the property dispute. His law firm now handles all legal matters for Luminous Consulting, and he often refers clients who need both legal representation and reputation management services. The partnership has been mutually beneficial, combining legal expertise with marketing strategy to help clients recover from various forms of betrayal and exploitation. David jokes that Patricia's scheme created the perfect professional collaboration, bringing together complementary skills in a practice area that's unfortunately more common than most people realize. Looking back on the 3 years since Patricia's arrest, I recognize that her attempt to destroy my life actually catalyzed the best period of my adult existence. The strength I discovered while fighting for my home became the foundation for professional achievements that seemed impossible. When I was accommodating her manipulation and questioning my own instincts, the confidence I gained from defeating her elaborate scheme has opened doors and created opportunities that the old, conflict-averse version of myself never would have pursued. The most valuable lesson from the entire experience has been learning to trust my own judgment about people and situations, even when that judgment conflicts with social expectations or family harmony. Patricia's manipulation succeeded for months because I ignored red flags and explained away concerning behavior out of misplaced politeness and conflict avoidance. The woman I've become pays attention to those warning signals and acts on them quickly, protecting both herself and the people who depend on her leadership. This morning, as I prepare for a presentation to potential clients who are dealing with their own crisis of betrayal and trust, I feel grateful for the hard lessons that came with Patricia's attempted theft of my life. The experience taught me that I'm capable of protecting what matters to me, that family relationships don't justify accepting abuse or manipulation, and that sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is refuse to be victimized by someone else's dysfunction. The house my grandmother left me remains in my name, secured by locks Patricia will never touch and protected by legal safeguards she could never circumvent. But more importantly, it's protected by a woman who learned to fight for what's hers, and discovered that she's much stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The deed to this house is still in my safe, but it's no longer the only property document I protect. The portfolio has grown to include commercial real estate, investment properties, and business assets that represent the empire I built on the foundation of refusing to be victimized. Patricia wanted to steal my security, but instead she inspired me to create security beyond her wildest comprehension. Standing in my expanded office this afternoon, looking out at the garden where Patricia once pretended to offer helpful advice, while planning my exploitation, I feel a deep satisfaction that goes beyond financial success or professional achievement. I've become exactly the person my grandmother hoped I would be when she left me this house: strong, independent, and capable of protecting what matters most. The woman who once apologized for scheduling business meetings in her own home now runs a company that helps other people recover from betrayal and manipulation. The person who avoided confrontation to preserve family peace now specializes in fighting back against sophisticated attacks on personal and professional reputation. The naive target who welcomed a manipulative house guest has become a force for justice and empowerment in her community and industry. Patricia Thompson spent months researching my vulnerabilities and planning my exploitation, but she made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that kindness and accommodation were signs of weakness rather than strength, and that someone who valued harmony would be unable to fight when everything she loved was threatened. That miscalculation cost her everything and gave me a life beyond my previous dreams. The locked suitcase that once contained her surveillance materials now sits empty in my closet, a reminder of how close I came to losing everything through misplaced trust. But it's also a symbol of victory, proof that even the most elaborate schemes can be defeated by someone who's willing to stand up for what's rightfully theirs. Today marks exactly 3 years since I discovered Patricia in my office with my property documents, the moment when I finally understood that her helpful facade was cover for systematic exploitation. Looking back, I recognize that moment as the beginning of my real life, the point when I stopped being someone who happened to things and became someone who made things happen. The transformation continues every day in business decisions made, with confidence rather than anxiety, in personal relationships based on mutual respect rather than accommodation, and in a deep understanding of my own strength and worth. Patricia's attempt to steal my life ultimately gave me a life worth protecting, and I'll defend it with everything I have. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.